Now, I take great pleasure in announcing tonight's speaker, Gordon Gray-Stevens, who is the director of the Native Woodlands Cooperative in Scotland, who's going to tell us about the significance of Argyll's Temperate Rainforest. Gordon is also a great supporter of Kilmartin Museum and is one of our valued trustees who has helped us along our redevelopment journey. So thank you for that. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you now, Gordon.
Thank you, Jackie. That was a very welcome introduction. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
You can tell me to start with what you can see on your screen, if anything, in terms of my presentation. Does it look as it should do?
Yes. Yes, it looks perfect, Gordon. We can see everything.
Good. That's a relief, as whilst it all worked very well 20 minutes ago, it stopped working quite so well about 10 minutes ago. So I'm relieved to know that I will have some notes to work off. Because always when talking to archaeologists, when you're not one yourself, you have to be a bit careful about your BCs and your ADs. So, yep, I'm going to talk about the significance of Argyll's Temperate Rainforest this evening. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I'm about. Jacqueline's already mentioned the Native Woods Cooperative. There's a website link. I'm also, the Native Woods Cooperative is also a member of something called the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest, and I'll be talking about the work of that organisation during the course of this presentation as well. So tonight I'm going to talk about rainforest history. I'm going to talk about rainforest values, threats to the rainforest, and what's going on at the present time. And I'm going to show you some pictures as well, so that if you get bored of listening to me, you can look at them instead. On the left there, we have some script lichen next door to what is known as blackberries and custard lichen. I hope you can tell the difference between script and blackberries and lichen. Blackberries and custard, because otherwise your choice of dessert won't necessarily be straightforward. So if we go back through to history, I'm sure we're all aware that this part of Scotland was covered in ice until remarkably recently, really, and most recently from about 13,000 years ago until 11,500 years ago, when something called the Loch Lomond Advance was the last time that ice reached down into Argyll. Essentially, what glaciers do, what ice does, is it scrapes everything clear down to rock. So everything that's happened in terms of nature development in Argyll has happened since in the last 11,500 years. Woodland was a big part of this development. So tree leaf litter develops soil. Some trees are better growing on with less soil than others. So certain trees are pioneer species like birch, willow, and alder, for example. The seed spreads very quickly in the wind. They're short-lived, and they're really helpful in terms of growing the soil and creating the conditions for more advanced woodland specialists such as oak, elm, ash, hazel to come along as well. When we talk about, and there's I guess I have to address the Great Wood of Caledon. So this theory that Scotland was covered in trees until the Romans or the Vikings or the deer or something or other destroyed it all. What the current thinking is that Scotland was probably around 65% woodland cover, and that this was a mix of both open and closed woodland cover. So sometimes you'd have a few trees dotted around the landscape. In other places, you'd have dense thickets of woodland. And this woodland would have extended quite far up our hills as well, well over 1,000 meters. So, but would have got a lot smaller by the time it was at the top of the hill. So it might only have been a couple of feet tall. The maximum extent of woodland in Scotland was probably around 6,500 years ago. And at that point, climate changed. So woodland retreat is partially due to climate, but equally not long after that, mankind got seriously stuck into farming in Scotland. And if you want to farm, having too many trees isn't necessarily the answer. So generally, it's regarded as a mixture of the impact of climate change and human activity that has resulted in the decline in woodland cover. So we know that these woodlands were open because they were inhabited by animals that needed a lot of space to move around. That's a set of elk that appeared out of a bog, admittedly in Ireland, that were hanging in the dining room in Torresay Castle on Mull under the previous owner. Big things, you know, those things are 12 foot across or thereby. You don't swing those things around unless you've got a lot of space to do it in. There were also large cattle, aurochs, wild cattle roaming around Scotland at the time. Again, substantial beasts, a couple of meters high, and landscape formers, essentially. They were quite good at pushing over small to medium-sized trees if they got in the way. We know also that mankind started to have an impact, as I've said already, on these woodlands. And before farming arrived in the Mesolithic times, we see the first kind of evidence of mankind's impact on woodlands in Argyll, admittedly on one of the islands, on Colonsay. Hazel was a valuable hunter-gatherer food resource at that time. Professor Steve Mython on Colonsay dug these, found and excavated these circular pits in the ground. And within those pits, they found up to what he calculates to be 500,000 hazelnut shells that were, or the remains of 500,000 hazelnut shells that had been processed in around 9,000 before present. He sent these off for analysis and asked the question, how long would it have taken, you know, how long would those have accumulated over? And the answer from the specialist came back, oh, in quite a short period of time. How short? Oh, probably a few weeks. So these guys apparently collected some of, well, his low estimate is 200,000 to 500,000 hazelnut shells in the course of one season from one island. Obviously, hazel is a really good source of winter protein, especially if you roast it beforehand. It preserves very well, and it's thereafter light to carry. But the idea of these guys processing so many hazel in such a short period of time is quite dramatic. His next bit of research was even more dramatic. That revealed that shortly after the collection of these hazelnuts, something removed most of the hazelwood cover on Colonsay. Who knows what that caused that? It's not clear, but that could very well be something to do with humanity. It's difficult to see what else it was, quite honestly, other than deliberate destruction on quite a large scale of a valuable food resource. If I jump forward to the next time that, I'm jumping forward to about a month ago, but anyway, I'm using this slide to illustrate something that happened about 5,500 years ago or so. And this is about timber utilization, because quite often what we can see in the archaeological record about woodlands, and we have to speculate a little bit as a result of what we see in the archaeological record. Quite often it's the wood that we see in the archaeological record that helps to inform what woodland might have looked like in Argyll in prehistoric times. So this is an oak post embedded in the beach at Kintraw at the top of Loch Craignish, and is part of Lizzie Rose's Carbon Legacy exhibition that will be part of the opening art exhibition at the at Kilmartin Museum in a few weeks' time. She was mimicking or recreating a process that happened within the glen at Kilmartin around 5,500 years ago. There was a substantial Cursus monument around 400 meters long with a 280, 300 oak posts between 20 centimeters and 1.2 meters across in the landscape. So remarkable construction. And the earliest monument that we know about in Kilmartin Glen. Again, a substantial construction, a human impact, rather like the hazelnuts, but in a different scale and with a more dramatic landscape impact. But again, something that was very quickly followed by destruction. So, and we know that that destruction was by fire because of the charcoal deposits that were left behind. So we know that in a relatively short period after this enormous monument was constructed, it was burnt down in one episode. The next monument that we know about in Kilmartin Glen is around 3,500 BP, so 2,000 years later, and that was a timber circle that was built in the same location next to the cursus. We know about this, of course, because of the quarrying activity that's taken place there. But I think, and it was at the time of discovery, I think the second largest timber circle in Britain. I think the interesting thing about that, or one of the things we're not really very conscious of, is the time scale that prehistory covers. So, you know, that's 2,000 years of human history, and there are only really those two monuments to go by. Both of them quite substantial, but there was a remarkably long period of human history of a kind of apparent stability, as far as we can see. Moving forward a little bit further, we come to the coal hoard, found again on an island off Argyll. Coal hoard found about 3,000 before present, so 3,000 years ago in the late Bronze Age, and you're looking here at the remains of the haft in one of the spears that were found as part of this hoard. So three of these bronze deposits had some wood left in them, and recovering wood is relatively rare in Argyll because we have a wet and acidic climate, a wet climate and acidic soils, which gets rid of wood quite effectively. Anyway, both ash and hazel found in the coal hoard. Move a little bit closer to Kilmartin Glen for a view of Brook and Drummond. I guess that it's now slipping into pre-memory at least, but this is a view looking across Kilmartin Glen to the moment when the quarrying was a little bit more obvious. So that's somewhere hidden in those trees is on the left on the flat ground is the Rycruan cairn, and to the right is Rycruan house in the trees there. And just immediately behind there on the slopes, you can see the indications of ongoing quarrying to supply sand and gravel for the Glashan hydroelectric works. The site was dug by Eric Cregeen in 1962. And this is a quote from the Duncan Abernethy's write-up of the site. So we know at this stage that there was a mixture of woodland in Kilmartin Glen. Of course, as well as building houses out of this wood, we also know that people used it to get around. And I guess any history of history of Argyll involves the sea, and especially as a means of transportation. And the Brook and Drummond is really the occupation period for that matches quite neatly with the Dalriadan period. And of course, sea was a major part of that civilization, that period of history. And we start to get into history rather than prehistory there as well. So this was, of course, the period when St. Columba arrived across, and Adaman, who is his biographer, tells us that the monks were bringing oak timber from as far as Sunart, so that's the other side of Mull, to Iona so they were dragging oak by sea. They were towing oak logs behind curraghs, rather like the one that I showed in the previous picture, but probably slightly larger with more people on board to do the rowing. But they were dragging oak logs from Sunart around to Iona. The first chapel on Iona was almost certainly built out of oak paneling rather than stone. Well, of course, this represents one of the cultural high points of Argyll, and I'm always amazed by the Book of Keels, and whenever I get the chance, I show people a picture of it. So there's a wee bit of the Book of Keels. Of course, that led to a rather more dramatic use of timber. This is one of the Viking boats that's been recovered from the sea and is in a national museum across in Scandinavia now. Their longboats were long, over 100 foot long. They were planked in cleft oak. And now cleaving oak is a bit of a skill, and you can't do it unless you've got the finest of wood. So you need furniture grade oak, long, tall, straight oak trees to be able to plank your longboat in oak. And there are indications that one of the reasons that the Vikings wanted to come to Scotland was because they'd rather run out of oak themselves, and Scotland represented a resource. And we do see Irish timber as well turning up in one of the boats at Roskilde, which is another of the major centres for the recovery of Viking age boats in Denmark. If I skip forward a few hundred years in history, we get to the Lords of the Isles. They apparently had a technological innovation that helped them get rid of the Vikings. They invented the rudder, which was quite handy in terms of maneuverability. So rather than using steering boards, they moved to a rudder, and that apparently helped in the fight against to dispel the Vikings. I think intermarrying also helped. This is the Eilach, which is a replica built for the Clan MacDonald Trust in the Crinan Canal. Of course, slightly out of place, therefore. They would have had to drag it across at that time. It's interesting that within Scottish shipbuilding, oak also became an issue. And for a while, when the Campbells had taken the mainland of Argyll and the Lords of the Isles still held the Isles, the Campbells forbade the MacDonalds to access oak timber for their ships from mainland Argyll, and the MacDonalds had to go to Ireland to their cousins to get the oak that they required to build their burlins. It's at about this time that we first see records of woodland management in Argyll in the rainforest. Inveresgren and Glenure up on Loch Etive side were places where the Lords of the Isles got their bows and arrows from. And the Fletchers, a long-standing family in Argyll, where the Fletchers are the arrow makers to the Lords of the Isles, and they held ground because of that. Again, another flourishing at this period during the Lords of the Isles in Argyll's cultural histories, where we see the gravestones, chapels and castles. Lots of stone, but obviously requiring decent chunks of timber as well. At a more domestic level, stone wasn't really used as a building material. People built houses, they built creel houses essentially, woven panels, wattle panels, at quite a large scale as well. So Clanmaran of Glendessery was a tacksman, a substantial tenant of the Cameron of Lochiel out in Morven. And at this time, Cameron of Lochiel also lived in a wood mansion built out of Scots pine, right enough. But wood was widely used as a building material. And it was only as timber started to have a commercial value to the lairds that they prohibited their tenants from using wood to build houses. And we start to see the emergence of the stone Highland cottage that is now everyone's ideal of what the Highland landscape looks like. A wee whitewashed cottage under a slate or corrugated iron roof in the landscape, but that's actually a relatively recent idea. So before we leave this period of history, I think it's also worth reflecting on the way in which woods and the various woods that they had available impacted upon the culture of the people who lived here. And I'm going to illustrate that by looking at the impact of, and the way in which hazel was used and viewed through the course of the year, and also within culture. So we know that the Gaelic alphabet used the trees as to help people learn them. So every wood had every tree formed a letter in the alphabet, and C was formed by coal, by hazel. And there was an Ogham symbol for it as well there. Then as we go through the year, we find clearly the first west wind once the hazel is in flower, which I think is a rather specific thing. I'm not quite sure what the significance of that first west wind would be, but maybe a sailor on this call could tell me a little bit more about the importance of that first west wind. At Beltane, the 1st of May, hazel was one of the woods that should be included within your new fire. St. John's Day was the best day for cutting your dowsing rod, which I'm sure is something you'll bear in mind the next time you're after a dowsing rod. Hazel was the ruler of August. And the 14th of September, Holyrood Day was the traditional nut picking date. This was a school holiday until relatively recently, to allow children to get off to help pick the nuts that would form part of the winter food resource. This one I rather like. It's what you should be doing at Halloween, and essentially tells the story of a way of determining whether, if you're a young man or woman, whether you're in the presence of your ideal partner or not. So you select a hazelnut and you're in potential lover or partner, and yourself put your two hazelnuts together beside the fire. And if the two hazelnuts survive side by side and burn together trimly, then you've got a hope for the future. Whereas if they start out with saucy pride and jump out of the chimney, then you've got to look elsewhere, I'm afraid. So essentially, trees were embedded within the culture of the people who lived in this part of the world. Trees wasn't the whole story, though, obviously, and there was a substantial reliance upon cattle. Cattle are herbivore. They're quite useful in woodlands as well. Descendants from those aurochs I talked about earlier. This is a picture from relatively recently, one of the last droves in Scotland. So they were driven from the Highlands as store animals to trysts. There was one at Kimmickle Glacier on a small scale, but larger ones at Crieff and Falkirk. And from thence they were driven down to England, and most of the beef of England was apparently, well, a good chunk of the beef of England was supplied from the West Highlands of Scotland. And it was the main source of cash into the West Highland society as well. So it was selling the young stirk, off to the drover that paid the bills. Most of the rest of life up here was apparently fairly subsistence based. This all came to an end, or started to come to an end, after the 1745, the Jacobite Rebellion. It had probably already started to change, quite honestly, but certainly that was a very definite stop point for a lot of these old traditions. And it was around that time that a more industrial approach to woodland management in Argyll happened. So there was a shift from that subsistence economy to a cash economy. Suddenly the lairds, the clan chiefs, valued the idea of money more than they valued the idea of having a lot of active men who could stand beside them if they wanted to have an argument with their neighbor or anyone else for that matter. Around that time, the English Parliament also passed laws to prevent further coppicing of oak woodland in England. At that time, oak was everything for the navy, so you needed it still in the same way the Vikings looked and the Lords of the Isles looked for their oak. England wanted to preserve oak for the navy, but at the same time we were undergoing an industrial revolution, or the start of an industrial revolution, and oak charcoal was a key part in the production of iron at that time, as they hadn't got round to developing coke on a large scale, and you can't produce iron from coal unless you coke it first. So earth-burn charcoal, and that's what this picture on the left shows, an earth burn, modern day reconstruction of one of those from about a decade ago. That produced the charcoal that fed the iron furnaces. On quite a large scale, that's the gable end of one of the charcoal stores at Bonor Furnace, which was one of the two major industrial furnaces in Argyll, the other one being at Furness. Not a small scale enterprise, and had a major impact on woodlands. So in addition to the charcoaling impact, and also the impact of bark as well, which we've used for tanning leather from oak. But in addition to that, some of the estates around this time also started to spend money on woodland management. A lot of the Poltalloch estate records, the estate which owned Kilmartin and surrounding ground, a lot of those records are held by Argyll and Bute Council, including day books from their woodland management in the 19th century. They were quite busy. There are a few snippets there, but spending £40,000 on your woods in a 5-year period is, in a 6-year period is going it somewhat. That at that time that was substantial expenditure. There are periods in those books where you can count up. They record everyone who was working in the woods, and there was one January in the 1840s when in one woodland down above Achnamara there were 100 people working in the woodland on various tasks. So substantial employment, substantial expenditure, and also substantial impact upon our woodlands, which is why we tend to call them ancient semi-natural woodlands rather than ancient woodlands, because they have almost all been interfered with or managed by man in some way or another. In parallel with this, and replacing it to a large degree, because charcoal fell out of favor once coke was available and the industrial processes around coke had been perfected, the demand for charcoal fell away, and we started to get timber and also bark for tanning leather from our colonial properties rather than relying upon Scotland for them. However, sheep for a while did dominate in the West Coast, and they still do to some degree or another. So the arrival of sheep, and again, a different kind of larger numbers of sheep, different breed, a larger type of sheep that was left on the hill all year round, had a major impact upon the flora and fauna of this part of the world for a short period, until we discovered how to import stuff from New Zealand and Australia. So the boom period for sheep farming was quite short, although it has continued. It's always been at a lesser scale than it was during that first flourishing. And ecologists are quite often inclined to say that that was because there was a essentially the sheep took the good out of the ground, but that's difficult to prove. Shortly at the same time as shortly thereafter, the development of transport links and a new Victorian enthusiasm for deer stalking resulted in significant increases in deer numbers, another herbivore which has a significant impact on our woodlands to this day. If we move into the 20th century, we start to see a greater demand for timber from Scotland, particularly after the First World War. Timber is a big, heavy thing to import and we needed a lot of that during the First World War, particularly in the absence of plastic. Wood was used for boxes, for baskets, for carrying ammunition, for shoring up trenches. And we used a lot of timber. A lot of the timber that Poltalloch Estate planted was cut down during the First and Second World Wars to feed the war effort. And at that time, the decision was made to use non-native North American conifers to replace what were regarded as unproductive native woodlands. And during the period of about 30 years after the Second World War, around 30% of Argyll's rainforest was essentially planted with conifer. The picture here shows, if you look at the bottom of that oak tree, you can see a gouge in it. Essentially, somebody's been round with an axe and has killed the oak tree standing, and then these conifer have been planted around it for a timber crop, for a strategic timber crop. Of course, by the time they were growing these things, we were actually under threat of nuclear war, so the chances of needing a pit prop for your trench was probably rather remote. But we're always fighting the war, the last war, I think, or preparing to fight it. Anyway, that's my whistle-stop tour of history. I'm terribly conscious that it's taken me a long time to talk about, which hasn't left me very long to talk about rainforest values, so I shall try to speed up. Anyway, that's the next part of this conversation. What is a temperate rainforest? It's a rarer version of its tropical cousin. These blue strips show where it is to be found around the world. Scotland has the best remains of this resource of any part of Europe. It requires three things, and I guess that we all know that we have them in Argyll. First of all, it's a rainforest. It requires a lot of rain. Over 1.5 meters of rain a year, please. It also requires clean air, and Argyll has been blessed by that because the prevailing southwesterlies mean that Argyll has never been very heavily impacted by industrial emissions. But the closer you get to Glasgow, the poorer on the whole the rainforest gets, because the impact of industrial processes from Glasgow had a bigger impact on the woodlands. And finally, it needs an equable climate, neither too hot nor too cold. And Argyll produces that largely courtesy of the Gulf Stream, so it never really gets too cold. We have an oceanic climate in Argyll. And that has helped these various rainforest specialists, about which I will talk shortly, to have survived and flourished. So that's the rainforest band in Scotland. This is determined really by those three factors. So if you get too far east in Scotland, it gets dramatically drier, particularly. So along the length of Loch Tay, it gets an inch drier for every, it gets an inch per year less rainfall for every mile that you go east. So that's quite a dramatic drop off in rain along the length of Loch Tay. And as a result of that, by the time you get to the far end of Loch Tay, you're really outside the rainforest zone, unless you're in a gorge or very close to a big burn. So if we now turn to some of the things that live within the rainforest and why they are, what's so special about them. A lot of them are what used to be called lower plants, non-vascular plants. They don't have flowers. Sometimes they can be a bit inaccessible. Fischerina alboscripta, this one here, is a case in point. It wasn't called Fischerina alboscripta 5 years ago. It was called Graphis alboscripta. But the lichenologists have looked at it and decided that it's better suited to being a Fischerina than a Graphis, but it doesn't help, because calling something Latin doesn't necessarily make it very accessible to most people. And then you change the name just when even those few people who have learnt it have got a grip of it. Anyway, lichens are rather fascinating things if you find out a little bit about them. They're bizarre. At school, we were always taught there were two schools. There's the animal, or two kingdoms, the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. Lichens throw that over. They're a combination of fungi and an algae or a cyanobacteria. So they bridge those two kingdoms, which is unusual. They're also Fischerina alboscripta is an endemic species to Scotland. So when the world came up with the biodiversity treaties at Rio de Janeiro 30 years ago, essentially the West rather would like the idea of Africa keeping their lions and their elephants so that we could go on safari and look at them. They thought that rather unfair, as we got rid of all our wolves and things that might bite us or trample on us. So the deal that was struck was that every country should look at what was special in their country at a global level and then do something to look after it. So Britain got off rather lightly on that because we don't have anything. We've essentially got rid of most of our special stuff by several thousand years of fairly intensive land utilization. However, we have managed to hold on to Fischerina alboscripta. And that's the world distribution of Fischerina alboscripta. So Britain has a unique responsibility. Scotland has a unique responsibility to look after Fischerina alboscripta. But I don't think most people know what it is, never mind that we have any responsibility to look after it. So that's, I guess, is one little dive into why temperate rainforest in Argyll is so important, because if we're expecting other people to look after their rainforest, we have some obligation to look after our own. Some of it's a little bit more spectacular than Fischerina alboscripta. Various leafy lichens, which I'm sure we've all seen in the woods of Argyll. Pseudocyphalaria norvegica is a Norwegian specklebelly. That one even gets an English name. Far more common on the west coast of Scotland than it is in Norway. And I'm going to close off in terms of these lichens and fungi and lower plants by looking at glue fungi, because I think it's rather fascinating. So that branch of hazelwood is held on the trunk of the tree that it fell off, the hazelwood, by fungi, by glue fungi. So essentially it's glued, that branch, to the tree to gain itself a competitive advantage. So that every woodland is full of various fungi within the ground. And as soon as a bit of wood falls onto the ground, it gets colonized by fungi. But the glue fungi has found itself rather a unique little niche. By gluing the wood to off the ground, it keeps that little snack for itself. I think that's rather a remarkable adaptation. Of course, within these woodlands, we also get other things that are probably more appealing to the general public. Lots of bluebells in the spring. We get various rare butterflies. This is pearl-bordered fritillary. Declined by about 80% in UK as a whole. Argyll remains one of its strongholds, and it rather likes the habitat mosaic found in Argyll's rainforest. So the open glades, south-facing glades in woodland in Argyll, especially with a wee bit of bracken to provide some shelter in the spring. So it's one use for bracken in limited quantities for biodiversity purposes, and it is thriving within our rainforests. We also get the birds, of course, so woodpecker, spotted flycatcher, a whole selection of birds which rather like these western woodlands. And pine marten, not so great for chicken keepers, but it's a predator that seems to be responsible for keeping the red squirrel in the rainforest. So grey squirrel advanced very quickly from North America, having been released in the UK in Victorian period. They were on Loch Lomond side in the 1960s, and they've really not managed to make any progress into Argyll. And current thinking is that the thing that makes the difference is the pine marten. Grey squirrel are heavier, they spend more time on the ground than the red squirrel, and that makes them easier prey for the pine marten. So moving on to threats to the rainforest, because once we've discovered we've got someone we rather like it, we might as well find out what we should do to make it better. I talked briefly about deer before, and herbivores are the major threat identified by Scottish Forestry's Native Woodland Survey of Scotland, carried out about 10 years ago now. Herbivores are a natural part of the woodland, so we need to see them here, but in excessive numbers they eat the young trees, which is not so great. Deer have increased in Scotland quite dramatically over the last 50 years. And quite often we see woodlands as a result where there are no young trees. Invasive species form the second major threat, and of those, rhododendron is the primary threat. The suggestion by Colin Edwards in 2008 in a forest research paper was that the cost of removing rhododendron doubled every 20 years. There's another one, skunk cabbage, but there are a number of other species which are spreading into the rainforest and crowding out other species. Ash dieback is something we've all heard about recently, and that's spreading quite dramatically now. And everyone will have seen the impact that's having on ash in our woodlands. The final threat I would list is the status quo. Here we see a conservationist in fleece and a couple of a land agent and a gamekeeper in tweed. And you can see that the communication between the two of them is not great. So they're not talking to each other. And if people don't talk to each other, then very little happens. When it comes to rainforest action, I talked at the start about the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest, which is a relatively recent coalition of people who've come together to do something about the rainforest. Around 24 organisations from a wide range of backgrounds, so everything from Scottish Land and Estates, the Landowner Representative Organisation, to the Community Woodlands Association and Butterfly Conservation. Argyll and the Coast Countryside Trust are members as well, as Scottish Rural, the college, essentially, Scotland's Rural College as well. With an aim, we want to see Scotland's rainforest thrive again. It's gained a lot of political support. People like the rainforest tag, so it's a very clever bit of branding. I'm very glad that at least one of those members of the alliance works out how to influence people, because if as a conservationist nobody's interested in what you're talking about, you don't get anywhere. And rainforest is certainly a brand that attracts attention. So at the time last year, Mary McAllen, who was at that point the Environment Minister, here reiterating at an Alliance event Scotland's government's commitment to restore Scotland's rainforest. We see it in government papers as well. So our new Scottish Biodiversity Strategy talks about funding for restoring Scotland's rainforest, and the Scottish Forestry strategy implementation plan also has a priority around rainforest restoration. So the Alliance have been in developing a rainforest restoration fund, starting with the delivery of 4 landscape scale projects, of which one is in Argyll. One of those first 4 is in Argyll and is being led by the Countryside Trust in Knapdale. There are a number of other ones in preparation as well that will follow along behind these 4 policies, 4 projects, and those include some other areas of Argyll, hopefully Craignish, and also hopefully another project up in Appin, and another one over in Kilfinnan in Cowell. So the aim is to see large-scale restoration over the next 25 years. Of course, this does require that we work with landowners and communities, and again, on the whole, we're receiving a good reception from folk. And part of that is about developing mechanisms to make sure that not only are we doing the right thing by the rainforest, but we're also doing the right thing by the people. Argyll is also a very sparsely populated part of the world, and increasingly we have an aging population, and you can't restore rainforests without people, and without young people at that. So I would encourage you, if you'd like to learn more about this, to visit the Saving Scotland's Rainforest website and to read one or more of these publications that are on that website on the resources tab, which will tell you a bit more about the rainforest and the threats that it faces. So thanks very much for listening. Here's a final shot of a Highland cow doing the right thing in some rainforest up near Glengarry, helping the restoration there. Very happy to take any questions. And I'll see if I can end the slide.
Thank you very much, Gordon. That was great. I found out lots of things that I didn't know already, and I thought I knew the woods quite well. And we're so lucky here to have so many beautiful woodlands around about us as well. So thank you. Now I'm just having a wee look at questions here. Judy, you wanted to mention something about your ancestors. Is Judy Munn there?
I am here, and there wasn't anything to mention, just that I'm excited as an American to have come back to Argyll, where my ancestors came from, and I had the blessing of using the regional archive and finding out that my people lived on Potala.
Oh, right. Ah, interesting.
So I'll be back, believe me.
Oh, good. Well, the museum will be open, so you can come and visit us there and say hello too. That'd be great. But I loved hearing all about the history parts of the and all the information about the hazel as well. Some of which I knew, but I'll be trying out the 2 hazelnuts with my husband later. Well, I'll see what happens when we put them by the fire. But no, and I'll just see, is there any other questions at all? Is there anyone else? You could always just raise your hand and I can ask you, I could that you say. John, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah, just a question about funding. Does the Atlantic rainforest attract international funding of any substance that can be used to perhaps put aside land to protect and create new woodland? Did you hear that?
I did, yeah. I'm just funding is quite a complicated story. I'll talk about it a wee bit of. I didn't talk about it in the presentation, except to say that we were looking for it. The number put on restoration of the rainforest ecosystem is £500 million over a long period of time. So that is around about, we think that we would spend a maximum of 50 million a year. And we've asked Scottish Government for half of that, for £25 million a year, which is the same level of commitment as they've put into the Peatland Restoration Fund. it's around half of what we spend at the moment in the rainforest in public subsidy for land support. So most of that goes on farming, sheep farming, and it's a substantial sum of money. And the landowners, the farmers who are doing the farming, are often the custodians of the rainforest anyway. As we look to climate change, one of the ways in which people have responded to the threat of climate change is to reduce the amount of meat that they eat. The amount of meat that we eat in Scotland per head has halved in the last 10 years. So we're eating a lot less meat. We have a farming sector in the west coast of Scotland that is heavily dependent upon producing sheep for its livelihood. But actually most of it, the average hill farm in Scotland, in the west coast of Scotland, gets 70% of its income from the taxpayer. So we're paying farmers to grow things that we're increasingly not eating. Farmers are getting older and they're increasingly stopping farming. So what has been a thriving sector of the rural economy on the west coast of Scotland is now far less thriving than it was. So rainforest restoration could be a means of rejuvenating land use on the west coast as well. But inevitably, it's still a lot of money. And one of the things that we have talked of doing is matching the Scottish government. So I talked of getting half the money from the Scottish government, and the other half of that is destined to come from a mixture of ENGO fundraising. So RSPB and Woodland Trust particularly are remarkably good at fundraising, and rainforest is one of the things that it is relatively easy to raise funds for. So that will involve some money from overseas. In addition to that, organizations like Trees for Life, for example, are attracting money from overseas, and they're part of the Rainforest Alliance and are doing work further north on the west coast. So there is a mixture of domestic and international funding coming into the rainforest at the moment, and we envisage that will get ramped up in years to come. I hope that answers the question in a rather roundabout way.
It is. That's very helpful. But could you just say a word about how much of the spend that's going on at the moment is dealing with awareness raising? You know, obviously that's an important thing, to be able to take the people with you and to perhaps replace farming with something that's more sustainable and everything else. But that you've got to start that process now. I don't know how much is spent on that.
So at the moment, the Rainforest Alliance is a relatively recent idea. And this Rainforest Restoration Fund is something that was the work on that only started in a couple of years ago when COP came to Glasgow, essentially. So we were invited by Scottish Government ministers to put together a proposal. So that was that was the start of it. So that's not very long ago. I talked about the 4 landscape scale projects that are starting. And that's where the focus is at the moment, is in trying to make sure they're all slightly different, but they're all aware that they are pilots. So they are starting a process. We're not quite sure where the end point will be, but we will learn from those relative, small at a Scotland level, but quite large at a local level projects, how to progress. And that seems like an appropriate, so we have to be really careful not to try to run before we can walk. But we know a lot of the principles behind it, and a lot of the spend is on removing invasive rhododendron and in deer management, but it's also around introducing more cattle into the woodlands as well. So those are all skills. Now, they're not skills that people haven't got, essentially. So people who live and work on the west coast of Scotland, a lot of farmers know how to look after animals. They're all livestock farmers, essentially. Now, they might have moved on to sheep in recent years, and they might not be familiar with, for example, GPS collars. So you can now put a collar around a cow and you can control where it eats on your telephone. So you don't need fences to quite the same degree that you did 20 years ago. And it also means you can move the cattle around a landscape on a daily basis. So you can do something in the way of regenerative agriculture at the same time as making sure that the woodland gets the right level of grazing. So potentially, rather than having, as has been the case, where you have animals let loose, so ranching is one way of looking at farming in Argyll at the moment. This gives you far more control about where the grazing effort is, and as a result of that, you get a far different result from grazing. But a lot of these things that's relatively new, and there are people doing it, but it's not widely practiced in Argyll. So we're trying to introduce innovative techniques, but at the same time, some things have fallen out of favor. So if you go back 30 years, after the Second World War, more or less every country person in Argyll had been in the military, and they've been taught how to use a rifle. When you could almost see the population of deer increasing as people who had learned how to use a rifle handed it in or gave up on going out and getting a deer for the freezer. So we need to find a way of reinvigorating that kind of venison habit. And I did just see something in the chat whilst I was addressing you earlier, John, around venison. But and one of those reports that I popped up on the screen towards the end there, one of those 3 reports is around deer in the rainforest, and specifically looks at the way in which venison is dealt with in regard to the rainforest and how we cope with it at the moment. And there is a market failure there. So, there are now 10 years ago, there were 10 major processors of venison in Scotland. There are now 2.5, and the main one in Argyll closed down last year. So there's a landowner not far from where I'm sitting at the moment he normally culls 30 red stags in the autumn, and he doesn't know, he can't find anybody to buy those stags off him this year. So there's market failure in the venison sector at the moment, and that's something that needs to be addressed as part of this process. And it's not like, venison is free range, organic, local meat. What could be better? We should be eating more of that.
That's really interesting, Gordon, because there's a question that's come up about that. So Don, I'll go back to beavers in a wee bit, but we'll maybe ask Judy to say her question first. Is that okay? Judy, are you there? Judy Munn?
I think, yes, I'm here. I think Gordon handled that well. I think he's already addressed it about not only the publication, but some people with rifles going out and having a good meal.
Yeah, but you were saying about in Michigan that they use the meat that's caught.
Yeah, we have the same problem here in Michigan, to the point that whole neighborhood communities have, a dozen or more deer in their backyard on a regular morning, and some calls to the city councils and all to do a call, and then other people like, oh, poor Bambi, we don't want to shoot Bambi. And but generally when we do that here in Michigan, the meat is processed and given to shelters that are helping people who are experiencing homelessness. So it gives them a robust meal.
And Moira, you followed on from that as well, haven't you, Moira?
Yes, Cowell has Winston Churchill's, the deer stalking and processor in Cowell. They process and butcher the local shot deer here. He's just outside between Dunoon and Glendaruel. He's on the road between those two, and he's very popular. He makes everything. But I heard on the radio a few months ago that the NHS in some of the districts in England are encouraging the catering to have deer on the menus because of its good nutritional and low fat qualities as well. So that needs to spread to use the deer. My son's a deer stalker as well, so he's very keen on, doing this.
Good,
And-
we need
and-
more of it.
Yeah. Well, he's up in Moray. He's a
Right.
woodland manager up there.
Okay.
And
it is-
I'm sorry, Gordon.
If I said a bit more about deer, I think that the Michigan example is being followed over here a bit as well, and there is a bit of a change going on. So Tom Turnbull, who lives at the top of Lough Fyne, just on the edge of Cowell, he is the chair of the Association of Deer Management Groups at the moment, and he's very interested in different ways of marketing venison. And Cowell is an area that he's paying attention to. There are a lot of deer on Cowell, essentially.
Yeah, and ticks
Yes,
as well with them.
which is a health issue, of course, with deer. But there is, I think we might very well see them being venison being supplied to schools, for example, in Scotland in the next year or two. So there are movements in that way to get venison. And there's an initiative further north in the Highlands called From Fork to Plate.
That's right. Yeah.
So there is a process whereby people are getting geared up and doing a lot more now to get venison onto menus locally, and that will hopefully allow us to do something about deer numbers as well.
My son's involved in that indirectly.
Good. Right, good. Well, it sounds like a good initiative.
Yeah, and we've done projects in Argyll and Butte with schools as well on that. When in my former career as a teacher, we use that. I'll go back to Don's question now. Is that okay, Don? Are you there? If you want to unmute yourself, Don, you can ask your question, or I can ask it for you if you prefer.
Hi there.
Okay.
Yes, it's Don. Yeah, I've just got here. Yeah, my question really was, we've been to Knapdale quite a lot, and the beavers that have taken some time to establish themselves there. And obviously, it was how do they fit in the plan? I haven't heard anything mentioned about the beavers in the rainforests or in the forest areas. So I don't know if there's any feedback on that. Yeah,
so you nearly got to see a picture of a beaver this evening, but it didn't quite make the cut, I'm afraid. They're a woodland specialist. They are another herbivore, essentially, and one of the issues we have is too many herbivores, and sometimes too many of the wrong sort of herbivore. So I think, but in the same way that I was suggesting that we could cope with more cattle in our woodlands in this landscape, we can also cope with more beaver. I have a feeling that they're probably not, and there are some parts of the rainforest where they will thrive, but there are probably other parts of Scotland that they're better suited to. They probably prefer the slightly larger, or the middle ranges of the slightly larger rivers we get in Scotland, which are almost all, well, they are on the east coast essentially. So the population of beaver in Tayside has dramatically increased, whereas the population of beaver in Knapdale has clung on in there, but they haven't really thrived in the way that they have across in on the east of Scotland. It might be that if they got loose in, I don't know, up in around there are parts of Sunat or where they might have more success, but I think the place that they've been released is not necessarily the best place for beavers to thrive. But they are certainly a component of the rainforest, and a welcome one at that.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank
A
you.
quick one on the deer. On the deer front, we were speaking with a gamekeeper, an ex-gamekeeper, retired, and he said the main problem with venison is that you need to have a public health certificate, or every deer has to be checked for, health reasons. Is that a true fact, or is that being worked on?
There are considerable barriers to getting any meat into the public food chain. So you have to meet very stringent standards to make sure that the venison that you're selling is not a risk to the public.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it has been the case that the last two major outbreaks of E. coli or food poisoning in Scotland have been traced back to venison burgers.
Right.
So the Food Standards Authority in Scotland has essentially issued a warning that if it happens again, they will stop venison from entering the food chain because it's not worth the risk. So there are it's a difficult balancing act, essentially. If you get it wrong, a lot of people can get very ill. And as a result of that, the requirements for public health around venison processing, if you're selling it, are quite strict. Well, they're very strict, but I think they have to be, given the ability for badly handled venison to cause people severe upset and health upset, you know.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, understand that.
And we've got a question from Anna about Tainish, so I'll come to Anna, but just before that, I have to say that we've done a lot of work with Gordon and Heather in Tainish Woods, and I've done a lot with taking school trips up there to visit the cattle, which are there doing exactly what you said, Gordon. So good that it gets a mention. So Anna, what was your question that you wanted to ask Anna Corbett? Are you there?
Hello. Yes, yes, I am. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm very excited. I'm going to come to Kilmartin quite soon. I was hoping that the museum would be open, but it's not. It's not going to be. I shall have to come again. But while I'm there, I'm hoping to visit Tainish, and I'm just wondering how that, like what its status is in terms of, is it a good example of rainforest? Is it worth a visit? I mean, I've been before and it's wonderful, but I just wondered if you could maybe say a little bit more about the status of that place.
Yeah, I mean, Tainish is one of the largest remnants of rainforest in the west of Argyll, so very much worth a visit. It was, if you remember that picture of the earthburn charcoal mound that I showed in the middle of the talk.
Yes.
Tainish was the woods of Tainish was sold to the furnace at Bonor for a period, so it has been coppiced. And if you look at some of the oak trees, you can see the multi-stemmed essentially. So they have more than one stem coming from one place, and that's a sign that the oak has been coppiced. But they are marvelous places. They're full of biodiversity. I think there are a couple of lichenologists called Brian and Sandy Coppins who have done a lot to popularize, as far as one can, lichen in forestry world of Argyll, and they found in what they call the king hazel in Tainish. So somewhere lurking in Tainish, there is an enormous hazel by hazel standards. It's about 65 centimeters in diameter, which for a hazel is that's a substantial hazel.
Yes.
And over and above that, particularly on the east side of Tainish, if you wander off the path there a wee bit, beyond the mill, just about as you go down the peninsula from the mill there, there are lots of phoenix trees. So these are trees that have blown over and then grown up again. So trees are very difficult to kill. If they have if they blow over, they'll quite often trunks will grow up again. And there are lovely phoenix trees to see there as well. And again, dripping with bryophytes, lichens and mosses. So yeah, that's a very good place to see rainforest. There are other areas, Barnluscan, for example, as well, on the way down to Tainish. But Tainish is probably the one with the best path network in it, and also the most substantial area.
Yes. Oh, well, that's lovely. I'll look out for the king hazel then, and phoenixes.
Good.
Thank you.
And although the museum is shut, if you want to go on one of our guided walks, they're on Wednesdays, they're free guided walks. So have a look at the website and see if we can fit you in on the Wednesday, and you can have a look around the glen then.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Thanks.
And then we've got Kim had asked a question and Sharon sort of answered it. I don't know if you want to ask your question, Kim, and then we'll have a look at Sharon's answer afterwards. Is Kim there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Kim.
I was just trying to picture Kilmartin Glen when the natural waterways went through. I just wondered if there was any mapping of it.
Ah, right, the original mapping. Gordon, can you help there? I think there's a wee bit there from Sharon in the chat there.
Yeah, as Sharon says, you can see from the aerial photos where the old channels were, and it was canalized before the first edition Ordnance Survey map. So a lot of our records and ability to see where woodlands have been for quite a long time relies upon maps. And first edition Ordnance Survey was really which was from the 1850s, is really the first accurate map of rural Scotland. But the Kilmartin Burn was canalized before that map was produced, and that puts you back onto the and again, I can probably drop this into the chat, but it's worth looking at the National Library for Scotland. They've got the Roy maps, which are military maps which were produced after the 1745 uprising, and they were a relatively accurate map, and will show you, I'm fairly certain, that enough detail to see where the Kilmartin Burn used to go before it was canalized. But I'll drop a link to the National Library in the chat, and you can get a look at that.
Thank you so much.
But we message from Peter as well. Peter Buxton, are you there, Peter?
Hello, yes. I was just very interested in the talk about hazel. We have a little volunteer group called the Pre-Valley Volunteers, where we collect seeds from the Galloway forest and grow them on, and hopefully pass them on to other groups. And I was very encouraged by what was said about the various items of the talk. So yes, very illuminated on the uses of hazel as well. And yet it's quite we get folk asking for hedging material, and invariably they never ask for hazel. It's Guelder rose and hawthorn and blackthorn, but rarely hazel's included. But it's a thing that's improving anyway. Just a comment and a thank you for the talk, actually.
Thank you, Peter.
I guess that I really ought to say something about Galloway. Guy Shrubsole wrote a book called The Lost Rainforests of Britain last year, and of course he comes from England, so he's got a rather broader definition of rainforest than the one that I showed on this map, on the map earlier in the talk. We don't have the Scotland's rainforest. We decided to be a bit exclusive because it would be too easy to include almost all of Scotland within the rainforest zone, and that would stop it being special. So, Peter, if you want to feel part of the rainforest movement, you'd be better off allying yourself with Guy Shrubsole and the British rainforest movement than you would be with the Scottish rainforest movement. Because the chances are that down in Galloway, you've got a lot better rainforests than they have in most of the west of England. And other than that, good luck with your collection.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's everybody, and thanks for putting the link there to the map, Gordon. That's great. So people can have a wee look and click on that to follow the maps there. I'd like to say thank you very much to Gordon. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that, and really positive about what's happening as well. So thank you. And then it's just to say goodnight to everybody. And our next evening talk, we're having a wee summer break, and we'll be starting again in the 21st of September. And the next talk that we have is Dr. Lizanne Henderson from Glasgow University. Will be talking about Northern Malethus witch hunting and witch beliefs in the Scottish Highlands. She was talking originally, it was meant to be last year, but it was cancelled at the last minute. So if you would like to book on that, you'll have to wait because we're just getting our new booking system in operation, but we'll announce it in our newsletter. So sign up for our newsletter. And also, if you look out on social media, on Facebook and Instagram, or on our website, we'll have the information there. And the other thing to say is all our wonderful talks have been recorded. So if you want to go back and listen to anything, Gordon's talk will be available probably in between 2 and 4 weeks once it's been edited and downloaded onto our website, or sorry, the YouTube channel. But you can actually subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, and you can go back and see all the ones that you would like to have a look at. So hopefully, if you subscribe, it tells you when new ones are released as well, so you get a notification. So hopefully you can reach us that way as well. So thank you again, Gordon, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to welcome you back to Kilmartin soon, or back to our next evening talk. So thank you and good night.